Hi everyone, my name is Brady Robards. I'm a senior lecturer in sociology at Monash University in Australia, and I'm recording this presentation from Melbourne. Um, and I'm really excited to be part of this conference. It's my first ICA, and it's also my first virtual conference, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how it all works. Um, Thanks so much to Kath Aubrey for bringing us together on this panel. There's an amazing lineup of speakers, and I'm really honoured to be part of it. I'm going to try and keep it really quick, so I'll get straight into it. So this paper is drawing on data from a study that we conducted here in Australia, looking at social media use among young LGBTIQ plus people. I'm largely going to be talking about data from a survey we conducted in 2016. So this was a while ago now, but this was one of the key interesting findings that emerged from this research for us, looking at the ways in which dating and hookup apps are used beyond hooking up. So we're interested in this paper to explore some of these themes around friendship, connectedness, and community for young LGBTIQ plus people in Australia when it comes to these dating and hookup apps. So of course we know that dating and hookup apps have become an important part of how LGBTIQ plus people not just find sex and relationships, but also for how they conceptualize space, how they imagine community, how they build and imagine friendships, how they navigate travel, and feeling connected more generally. A really important part of this dynamic in dating and hookup app spaces is visibility as well. And visibility, I think, is crucial to being queer. In some contexts, it's about passing as straight or as gender conforming to avoid being beaten up. But invisibility in this way can also be a survival tactic, whereas in other contexts, visibility is about perhaps for non-binary people, for example, rejecting gender markers and being transgressive. Or it can be about being flamboyant and femme in a parade adorned with glitter and rainbows, a celebratory kind of visibility. But visibility can also make people feel uncomfortable. It can be displacing. So I'm thinking about visibility as a kind of assemblage of experiences and feelings and emotions in this context. And I think that dating and hookup apps are a really important part of this kind of queer visibility assemblage. So what we're going to look at in this paper in particular, and again, I mentioned it's from a study that I've conducted with colleagues of mine, this paper in particular with my co-author Brendan Churchill, but also with colleagues Paul Byron, Son Vivian, and Ben Hankel, who are part of this Scrolling Beyond Binaries study. And you can see a link to our website here. In terms of the background, I won't rehearse all of this. The other speakers in this panel have no doubt done a really good job on this, so I'm not going to go through all of this. But of course, there's a lot of research on the use of dating and hookup apps, especially amongst queer and gender diverse people. There's a really growing literature there, and there's a long history of dating apps, but websites, and even before websites, studies into the communication technologies that queer and gender diverse people use to connect. So, a brief summary of some literature that we're connecting with here around reconfiguring relationships, around thinking about the impacts on gay clubbing scenes and cruising practices, the implications from sociological perspectives around modern romance, or what Bauman talks about in terms of liquid love, some questions around the digital and physical boundaries in dating, and questions of authenticity, looking at same-sex attracted young people negotiating safety and risk. And I'm talking here about research from other people on this panel, including Kath Aubrey, with Paul Byron, who's a contributor also to our study, and Steph DeGay, who's also a panelist on this panel. To thinking about experiences of harassment as feminist discursive action, I'm thinking here about the work of Frances Shaw, and of course the many methodological implications around how to incorporate the use of dating and hookup apps into research. So there's a whole bunch of background here that I've just kind of skimmed over, but wanted to nod at in the way that we've started conceptualizing this paper. So let me talk directly about the study. The Scrolling Beyond Binaries study was a survey of over 1,300 young people in Australia that was conducted in 2016. we had a really diverse range of participants. About a quarter of our respondents were male, almost half were female. We also had about 20% of people who identified as non-binary or genderqueer. In terms of sexuality, about a third of our respondents identified as lesbian or gay, and around a quarter as bisexual, but also almost 20% as queer, with a range of other identity markers in terms of gender identity, but also in terms of sexuality. In terms of the platforms people were using, Facebook was very much the dominant platform amongst our respondents, followed by other platforms like YouTube, Instagram, Snapchat, Tumblr, Twitter, and so on, that we've written about elsewhere. And again, if you want to have a look at any of our previous publications, you can go to our website, scrollingbeyondbinaries.com, and there'll be links there, or feel free to contact me directly. I'm happy to share them with you, where we've talked about social media use more generally. But in this paper, we're really interested in dating and hookup apps specifically. So amongst our respondents, the most popular hookup apps or dating apps that we use were Tinder, Grindr, OkCupid, Her, and Scruff. And I'm going to be focusing on those 5 in terms of the analysis around friendship and connection more generally. So it will come as no surprise to people that use dating and hookup apps, or people that are part of queer and gender diverse communities, that they use not just for hooking up, but for other things, for friendship and for connections more generally. So our respondents did mostly use these apps to connect with potential romantic and/or sexual partners, as I'll demonstrate in a moment, but they were also using them to connect with friends. For some people, this was a primary motivation for using these kinds of apps, but for others, and more than in terms of a primary motivation, it was a kind of secondary use of these apps. And I'll show you this data. So as you can see here in the column on the left, most of our respondents who were using these kinds of apps were using them to connect with romantic and/or sexual partners. But there was also a smaller group of people who were using them to connect with, primarily to find friends. Now, the interesting difference here in these apps, if you look at Tinder, OkCupid, and Her, between 12, 13, and 15% were using them to primarily meet new friends, whereas on Grindr and Scruff, the apps targeted mostly at gay men, the percentages are lower, so 6% on Grindr and 7% on Scruff. But when we go to the next slide, I want you to look at Grindr and Scruff again, and look at the differences in terms of who they're actually connecting with. So if we look specifically to Grindr and Scruff here, you can see that even though only 6 and 7% said that they were primarily motivated to use these apps to talk to friends, they were mainly there to meet sexual and romantic partners. They were actually the apps that the users of Grindr and Scruff tended to be more likely actually to be talking to friends on these apps. So to zoom out again and away just from Grindr and Scruff, you can see in this final column here that between 89 and 97% of people were using these apps to meet potential romantic and sexual partners, but they were also using them to connect with friends, acquaintances, and more generally people they would like to meet, not necessarily for sex or relationships. So what really stands out here, I think, is that the apps like Tinder, OkCupid, and Her, there were people using them to talk to friends, but Grindr and Scruff, people tended to be talking to their friends even more in these spaces. Not to say that was the most dominant form of connection. Obviously, it was potential romantic and sexual partners or people they would like to meet more generally, but there was also this sense of connecting with friends, especially on Scruff and Grindr. The other experience that we alluded to in the abstract for this paper was a more negative side. So the centrality of friendship and connection is really clear in these spaces, but there were also a range of experiences of marginalization, rejection, exclusion, and largely when people reported this, they were reporting experiences of discrimination. So I don't want to paint dating and hookup apps for queer and gender diverse people as an entirely positive space. Of course, there are these negative experiences as well, and that's important when we're thinking about the ways these technologies connect people, because there are also these lateral forms of disconnection and marginalization that are an important part of the picture. So I know I've really sped through that. I wanted to try and get to this point within 10 minutes and wrap up just in a couple of minutes now. Again, if there's anything in here that you'd like to learn more about, please have a look at some of our other publications and connect with me, email me, send me a message on Twitter. I'm happy to chat to people and send you more information. There's also our website, scrollingbeyondbinaries.com, where you can find more information. But just to wrap up, it's clear for us from the data that we've collected as part of this project that hookup apps can afford a greater sense of connection and community with friends and queer networks, but they can also, as I mentioned in the previous slide, lead to a greater risk of feeling rejected, excluded, or both. So this makes sense, right? Because you can't be rejected or excluded from a community you're not part of. So there's that sense of being disconnected, being marginalized from a group that should be embracing you, that you feel part of, hurts much more. One of the really interesting findings we've also alluded to here very briefly in this data is that users of apps targeted at gay men like Grindr and Scruff tended to be primarily motivated by meeting romantic and/or sexual partners, but also, and this is an interesting kind of paradox, they were also the apps on which people were more likely to connect with friends. So even though it wasn't their primary motivation, they were connecting more with their friends than on other apps like Tinder, OkCupid, and Her. Now, is it something about the apps? Is it the affordances of the apps themselves? Is it something about the kinds of communities that are using these apps, the differences perhaps between the people that are using apps targeted at gay men versus more inclusive or broader kind of apps like Tinder and OkCupid? What is it that produces these kinds of differences in terms of both primary motivations but actual practices around connecting with friends? So in summary, we want to say that hookup apps can afford a type of visibility that connects, but also affords intragroup invisibility, whereby people feel excluded or rejected despite their visibility. And this is especially as related to race, sexuality, so biphobia in otherwise gay or lesbian spaces, for example, gender, like transphobia and femphobia in predominantly cis or cis spaces or spaces where masculinity is kind of valorized, the kind of mask for mask kind of tagline you can imagine, but also in terms of age and appearance. All right, I'm going to leave it there. I hope you're enjoying your conference, and I hope this panel has been useful and productive for you, and I'm really looking forward to seeing the other papers that are part of this panel as well. Have a great conference.